Hello and welcome to this interview where I should be talking with returning guest Tom Rowsell. How are you?
Not bad, thanks, Bo. It's good to be back.
Yeah, no, great to have you back. Last time we talked about sort of much more pre-history or sort of like bell beakers and Iron Age and that
Silbury
sort of
Hill,
thing,
yeah.
Silbury Hill. So I
Yeah.
thought this time we could skip out the Romans because what did they ever do for us?
Yeah.
And start talking about I thought try and pick your brain a bit about the Anglo-Saxons.
That's a topic I love.
So everything from sort of 410 when the Romans left through to 1066.
Yeah.
Just sort of a bit of an overview,
Mm.
an hour and a half on that, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable for people out there.
Yeah, whatever you want to know about, I'll try and talk about as much as I can. It's a topic I love, but I focus on specifically my areas of study for the Anglo-Saxons has mostly been to do with like the culture,
Okay.
the religions, the paganism and Christianity, the social structure, and the general like Germanic ways of being, like how they treated their lords, how they organized the land, and how they made their art, where their art originates, and this kind of thing, rather than the dates that the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms went to war with one another or things like that. I know a bit about that, but that's like many people who are historians, like that would be their focus, and they'd say, oh yeah, well, when Offa did this and that and whatever, but it's not the kind of history that is most interesting to me.
Okay, cool. Well, I thought I'd go through it sort of vaguely chronologically and just wherever the conversation takes us. Because my understanding is much more that sort of classical, much more classical sort of historian. What kings, what dates, what kingdoms overtook what other kings. So hopefully between us,
we'll get a more comprehensive picture. Then you can pick up where I'm weak.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is before we sort of start is just in a general.
We haven't started.
A general, yeah. Sorry, before I start on like what happened in 410 or 409. Just a general point. I was reading a book just the other day for this, just sort of brushing up, more modern book. Mark Morris it was, and he was just making the point that I thought was interesting, that the world in say 450 AD, all of this is going to be AD. The world in say 450 is very, very, very different to 1050.
Yes. Yes.
But people, a lot of people might think, fairly low resolution. It's just the Anglo-Saxon period. It's just they're all, like there's not much difference between Radwald and Harold Godwinson. But in fact, they'll be very different people. They lived in very different worlds. Do you think that's fair to say, or is that an exaggeration?
I think there's some problem like with what Dark Ages mean. Like nowadays, historians don't say Dark Ages, but because they think it's misleading. It wasn't a Dark Age in some respects, but and so it less popular to use. But it was a Dark Age. Initially, it was called a Dark Age because we don't have as much insights in this dark period. The Romans wrote a lot of things down. And then suddenly, as the Roman Empire falls, there's just this period where we don't have much written down until like the monasteries start, writing stuff down a lot again. So like the High Middle Ages is not really the Dark Ages. Like when we think of knights in shining armor, we're talking about 12th century, 13th century, whatever, 14th century. That is completely different. That period is a bit more like 1066, but the 450 is. It's an age of it's the dark age because it's not only did we can see production of like the kind of factories of the time, like producing pottery and stuff, they're just gone. They're not there anymore. People aren't producing things and distributing like en masse, like things like just basic stuff like pottery, and huge cultural turnover happens, turmoil, all different parts of Europe, not just in Britain, but like Clovis and the Franks. The Franks are like a Germanic people take over Roman Gaul, and that's like a completely different world from like you're talking about. Gaul was like a very well established Roman colony with a proper Romanized state and a system of taxation in place in Gaul, and suddenly it's completely ruled over by barbarians. And this is like not like the Middle Ages at all. It's more like a kind of the transition away from the classical Europe of ancient Rome into the dark period that leads into the High Middle Ages after this period of what Julius Evola, who's not a proper historian, is a philosopher of it more than that, but he calls it like the Nordic Roman culture, which is the period in which the peripheral barbarians merge with the civilized cultures of the Mediterranean to form the synthesis, which is Europe as we know it today, the Nordic Roman combination.
Because I'm one of those people who won't abandon the term Dark Age, because I know what I'm talking about there is the literary evidence.
Yeah, there's very little.
Because the archaeology, nothing stopped. Life didn't stop. So the archaeology is there's still tons of archaeology. And but in terms of the literary evidence, the light of history, in terms of literary evidence, it goes dark big time.
Yeah.
So, for example, quickly to say, because I quite often do at the beginning, towards the beginning of my videos, to talk about the sources. So, we're looking at the Venerable Bead.
Yes.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Yes. Gildas.
Gildas. And even you got maybe Doomsday. I know Doomsday, but I know that's like
later.
That's much later. But it is a snapshot essentially of late Anglo-Saxon England, not Norman England. I mean, it was 20 odd years after 1066, but still, it takes a picture of largely an Anglo-Saxon world still.
Yes.
So we've got bits and bobs.
Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yeah.
Asser's Life of Alfred. Those are the main things, anyway, for Britain at least.
Right, for Britain. There's other things, like what does Aldrich Vitalis talk about earlier periods? But the point is that that's not a great deal.
No, that's very not a great deal. We're talking about centuries of history for like several nations in the northwest of Europe.
And for the earliest bits, it's kind of Bead, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's so if he doesn't tell you something, then we just don't know. You've got the archaeological record, but in terms of literary evidence, it's really dark. It's gone dark.
There's not so much out there. It's not as much. Yeah, it is an appropriate term in that sense. It has some currency still. But also there is an archaeological equivalent as well. Like I said, there is a change. The Justinian Plague maybe contributed to this, but things are not like they used to be in northwestern Europe at that point. And it's not actually because the Anglo-Saxons brought a dark age. They came to a darkened place. It was very different. I like to compare for that period maybe France and England to show the difference, because Gaul was a Roman colony that was with proper Roman infrastructure and remained so even after the fall of Rome. Britain was not, because the Romans literally retreated in the same way the Americans retreated from Afghanistan. They just left. And the Romanized Britons who couldn't go and move somewhere else that was more civilized were just left with there's no infrastructure, and the roads weren't maintained anymore, nothing. It's a completely different thing. So when the Germanic barbarians invade Gallia and make it Gaul meaning land of foreigners, it's the same as Welsh. Gaul means foreigners. In Germanic, Gaul. They basically installed themselves as the new Roman elite in France, and call it France now. And they were able to tax the people in the same way it was done. That's not what happened in Britain at all. There was something completely different. And Britain, even before, when the Romans were here, they were like, this place is vulnerable from the Saxon shore, as they called it, which is the North Sea. They called it the Saxon shore because they knew the Saxons could always attack from that direction. And the Scotti, as they called them, is what we call the Gaels from Ireland. And there was the conspiracy of barbarians in the late 4th century, where there was a way of Romans were trying to make sure that the barbarians wouldn't invade their British colony. The British colony was always vulnerable to that. When, of course, the Romans left, they were proven right, because all these barbarian groups, the Picts, started harassing the Britons, the Romanized Britons to the south. And according to semi-legendary narratives, which I'm sure you're familiar with, by not Bead, I think it's Geoffrey or Gildas says the the King Vortigern was so fed up with fighting the Picts that he's like, we need help. Let's call on the Saxons to come and help. And he invited over these federati, or whatever they call them in Latin, to come and help them fight, and they didn't go away afterwards, which might have, obviously that can't explain the reality. I can talk later about the genetic and archaeological evidence, but that might be part of the real story.
Right. So, we mentioned that the Romans just leave. Honorius needs and Stilicho needs every last soldier and legionary back in Rome immediately because of Alaric. But it
another
doesn't mean
Germanic barbarian.
But it doesn't mean that all sort of, because historians describe the people now as sort of Romano Britons. So depending on how accurate you want to go with that, but the point is that Roman culture didn't just immediately leave. Like the villa culture still survived for a while. The archaeology seems to show that.
Yes.
So now we've got this sort of a transitional period between the Romans leaving and the remaining Romano Britons, and the first of many sort of waves of invasion from the continent, whether it's Saxony, Lower Saxony, Frisia,
and Ireland, the Scottish. This is the period that Pictland gets transformed into Scotland. We call it now because of this Gaelic tribe called the Scotti. But I think Romano Britain, you sound like you're a little bit not keen on the term, but I think it's very accurate, because these people are not like the Celts that Caesar met at all. Yeah. Even before then,
culturally,
like even before like proper Roman overlordship, the Gauls and the Britons had some coinage. They were making coins in the style of Romans. The people in Britain after the Romans left didn't even have coins. So they were more primitive in some ways than the pre-Roman Britain. That these people were so dependent on. It's it's a different kind of thing. It's like they were Romanized, and then the Roman infrastructure's gone. It's kind of like what would happen to us if our infrastructure's gone. There was no longer they couldn't live in the way they had previously lived, and there was this very great weakness as a result. There was no standing army to protect them from barbarians. There wasn't a system of a militarized system to defend from the Picts or any other enemies, and they obviously didn't have the economic structure in place that could deal with the sudden loss of trade with the continent. So it was pretty bad time to live. It was probably horrendous, actually. And even before the barbarians got there. And I don't know to what extent the Justinian Plague, this is something people would have, the Justinian Plague would have had some effect too, because that would have damaged the population.
We're talking, the 530s? Is that off the top of my head? Is that right, or is it later?
Well, it's just after Hagia Sophia is completed, isn't it?
So when's that? I can't remember.
I thought that was in the late 300s.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I thought it was just before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Now I'm questioning myself.
I've done content on Justinian, and both for my channel and on here, I've done a thing all about the Nico. I should know it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I thought Justinian was in the 500s, but
so Google.
Anyway,
anyway.
So you mentioned the Vortigern, and then Hengist and Horsa. So that's often where, if you read sort of a fairly low resolution history, like Churchill's History of the English Speaking Peoples, or I love Sir Charles Oman's History of the English, they sort of go straight in often with sort of the Hengist and Horsa thing. And one time I had you while we were talking, and we weren't talking about the Anglo-Saxons, I don't think specifically, but somehow Hengist and Horsa came up, and you said you thought they were probably entirely fictional, or maybe sort of gods.
They're gods. They are gods.
What do you mean by that? Tell me. What are you talking about?
For those who aren't aware, we should say first what you're talking about in the actual narrative presented, which is by a Celtic author, a Welsh author. The two twins come along for the Anglo-Saxons. The first Anglo-Saxons come, Hengist and Horsa. Now those names are unattested anywhere. They're not normal names, and they both mean horse, and they're twins. So if you're aware of Indo-European religions, they always have two horse twins, like Castor and Pollux in in the Greek Roman and Greek, the Dioscuri in Greece they're called, or in India they have the Ashvin twins, two twin horse boys, and they're always the sons or grandsons of the Skyfather. Hengist and Horsa appear in genealogies as the great grandsons or grandsons of Woden, the main god of the Anglo-Saxon pantheon. So they're twins, two males, both called Horse, and they're great grandsons of the Skyfather. It's pretty obvious. Also, these twins can sometimes play progenitor roles in various versions. Like in the version for Rome, they changed a bit, and they're more wolf boys called Romulus and Remus, and the two boys become the progenitors of the Roman race. So the English have like the progenitors of our racial progenitors are the Hengist and Horsa, this myth. And then the Welsh guy heard the Anglo-Saxon pagans saying this and says, oh, well, it was probably like, they're just people, and I'll euhemerize them as actual people and work a story into it where they're just normal people. But also there's Dutch, I can't remember, there's Dutch manuscript evidence where they talk about Hengist and Horsa as well, and they're a progenitor of tribe people in Holland as well. So it's like they have the same role in Holland as in England, where there's this divine, semi-divine descendants that link your people to the gods, because they're like the grandsons of the greatest god and they're our ancestors. So you know how it works.
Yeah.
And the horse stuff makes it pretty obvious. But so I think that what we're seeing here is a Welshified version of an Anglo-Saxon narrative, which was divinized, just like how the Odyssey, for example, includes the gods in the stories of the Trojan War, right? So the Anglo-Saxons would have a story of their settling of the British Isles, which incorporated the gods into it. And when a Christian Welshman hears that story, he tries to throw out all the pagan stuff and try and make it make sense from a rational Christian monk perspective. Hengist and Horsa are two guys.
Right.
That's what I think happened.
When you say it like that, it's extremely plausible. What's the Welsh connection? What are you talking about there? What, Jeff Smith Monmouth? Or where does it come from? Is it a Welsh version
the story of
Anglo-Saxon
the story of Vortigern that we just talked? That's from a Welsh source, isn't it?
Okay.
It's not Bead, is it?
I don't know where it first appears.
I believe
I don't know where that first appears.
I think it's Gildas or Geoffrey. I can't remember which one now. Okay. I get them mixed up sometimes, so that's not very good of me.
No.
They have very few sources for the period, but I managed to get them confused anyhow. But,
it's definitely the case, though, isn't it, that historians during the Dark Age or during the medieval period sort of tried as best they could to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
And so when they don't really know for sure what happened, they quite often, we sort of know now, don't we? I mean, it's the job of the modern scholar historian to say, that bit's not reliable. That bit in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle must be incorrect or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I think they were doing at the time as well. They're like, that doesn't match the Bible, so it's not true. So we know the Bible's 100% true because that's the only thing that is true is with Christian Catholic monks. And anything we hear that doesn't match the Bible is untrue, so we have to try and change it to make it match the Bible. So that's kind of that's just how people are. Like they have one reference point of truth, from a trustworthy source, and they try and make other things fit into that narrative.
Oh, definitely. We were talking earlier just on the podcast about how historians copy each other and sort of always have since antiquity. One classic example always sticks in my mind of that is that one of the biographers of Charlemagne described Charlemagne's eating and drinking habits, and it's exactly word for word Suetonius talking about Augustus. And so people in the more modern era have noticed that and said, oh, well, that's completely unreliable then. Augustus is like the perfect emperor. So
it's also just tropes.
We're just going to copy that. We don't know if it says anything truthful about Charlemagne.
Yeah, I think that tropes like that as well in storytelling. Like you notice a lot of Catholic, early hagiographies are the same as other saints. So you'll see two different saints with the exact same story. And it's kind of just like storytelling is, you can sometimes, maybe you'll watch a Spider-Man and it's the same plot as you saw in a Batman and they just took from an episode. Well, you know what I mean? The characters changed, but the stories, if someone knows a story that works, then they'll just kind of copy it. It's like that's a format of storytelling, and things get confused about the actual reality of events. But yes, certainly, whenever you see a story that you also see somewhere else exactly the same, then you should doubt the authenticity of it. But it might not necessarily, it might still have a kernel of truth. For example, like the mythologized narrative of the Hengist and Horsa thing, I still think that Vortigern it's perfectly possible that Vortigern imported mercenaries from Saxony, and that these people were like the first among a great number of other settlers who came later. Maybe, like they send word for more people. An army at that time could be very small, like a very small amount. It might have been that the amount of people Vortigern actually invited over was like 100 men. And certainly we know from like both a study of skull measurements from Eastern England at the time and another one of DNA of skeletons from the time, that between 75 and 80% of the population of the eastern seaboard of England was replaced initially. That is not possible with 100 soldiers. Yeah, there's no way. So there was wholesale migration of families and settler colonialism, which is not recorded in these sources, but it must have happened something like that. But this mythologized, that doesn't mean this mythologized sort of narrative of the events that we find in medieval sources isn't true. It might just be, a part of it. Like it's kind of like the Windrush now. Like everyone's talked about like the origin of like multiculturalism in UK as like Windrush. Not even 1% of the immigrant population of Britain comes from Windrush. It's not remotely significant in like the actual proportions, but it did actually occur. Windrush was a real event, and it kind of like has been mythologized as like a way for British people to understand multiculturalism. Something like that, maybe.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I mean, if I mention again that Charlemagne story, it might be because in that example, it was that he eats in this particular way and only has one glass of wine at dinner. It might be that was true about Charlemagne. The biographer knows, to describe that, that's true also of Augustus, so I will use it. It doesn't mean it's untrue. But still, anyway, these are the vagaries, of history. And we just don't have multiple sources to sort of cross-check things. Again, quite early on, if it's not in like the earliest bits of the chronicle, or if Bead doesn't talk about it, then we haven't got a great, there's no great sources to.
No,
it's only the archaeological record you've got, which is, by its very nature, incomplete.
But what we also have, and that, I mean, these are all true statements you're making, but I think sometimes they obscure what a lot of people don't realize is that the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes were just not like unique peoples. They were just Germanic tribes, and they were like all the other Germanic tribes. They shared they could speak to the other Germanic tribes. Their language, there wasn't an Angle language and a Saxon language. They just spoke like, Proto-West Germanic or something like that, like an early form of West Germanic, which became, Anglo-Saxon, Frisian, Old High German, like the languages that later derived from them. But even then, the North Germanic languages were mutually intelligible with early West Germanic. So it wasn't even like they were distinct from the people in Scandinavia that much. And the same gods, a lot of the same rituals, and they traveled around and they shared myths. Hence, the main myth that we got from Anglo-Saxon England, Beowulf, is set in Sweden. There's a reason for that, because they had these were part of their cultural horizon. They talk about the Goths and the Lombards in Beowulf. Like they're talking about these people as known peoples whose activities are relevant to English people because they were kinsmen. When St. Boniface from Devon was to preach to the Saxons in Germany, he does so because he says they are our brethren, they're our brothers, and he's not talking about brothers in Christ because they're pagans. He said we have to preach to our kin, they're the same people. So now when you understand that the entire Germanic world shared in certain cultures, then you understand that literary sources from other parts of the Germanic world are very instructive to help us understand what the early English were like. And we don't have sagas like we do from Iceland for England. But if you read the Icelandic sagas, you'll get a good insight into, and even sources, late sources from the Viking Age, or earlier sources like Tacitus describing Germanic tribes during the Roman times, you're still getting a good insight into what these people are like. Because even in the 1,000 years between the Viking, late Viking sources, like, in the Viking Age 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, Tacitus writing, and between that is the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. But there's some commonalities even at the far extremes of that millennium. So I think reading about Icelandic literature is important. I mean, I did a course in Icelandic literature at university as well, even though I was mostly studying Anglo-Saxon stuff, because the culture it depicts is very similar to the one you see in Beowulf or in Anglo-Saxon poetry.
It's remarkable, isn't it? It's remarkable. It's more homogenous then than now in all sorts of ways. Do you think in a broad sense that the sort of 5th century, 6th century invasions, migrations of the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, the Frisians, do we know if there's any evidence that they were forced that way by people more to the east? Like, I don't know, like the Swabi or something is forcing them to... Because the only reason I ask that, I think that, is that quite often in the east, in like the Eurasian steppe, that people sweep into Hungary and Bulgaria and the Balkans because they're pushed that way by a yet more ferocious people further to their east. Do you think there's anything in that with the invasions of Britain?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, I think there were, like, the migration period in general is a time when many peoples are moving around, hence the name, or the migration of peoples. It's called, like in Germany and other Germanic countries, it's literally called the race migration period, as in or the people's migration period, as in different peoples are moving, specifically not people but peoples en masse, and that includes the Huns, and the Huns are a big influence on the Germanic world for a long time afterwards. Like, the Viking sagas include Huns as characters. Attila the Hun is a character in Volsunga Saga, Atli, and the Huns are, they're there in the Germanic world. And I mean, even the Huns were pushing on the Goths. The Goths had invaded Ukraine long ago. The Goths had mixed with Huns, and the Goths in the East, Ostrogoths, disappeared because of that overmixing with, like, the steppe peoples, basically in the East. But them encroachments in, and the Avars, and that's causing other westward migrations of Germanics. It's not a coincidence that the Lombards and the Goths and all these different people are moving around at that time. But it's not recorded in any Germanic source as a catastrophe. It's, in fact, in Beowulf and in the sagas, this era is basically like a golden age. It's like the perfect period. It's like when everyone was more heroic and men were better. The men in the Viking Age described the migration era as being a superior time when everything was better. People were stronger and braver and everything was amazing.
But that's often the case. In the Iliad, old man Nestor's saying that on the beaches of Troy. Men used to be real men back when I was young, when my grandfather was... So is that not...
It's a human trait, but it's there in like a narrative context. When they're talking about that age, they're like, oh, in this golden age, a great age, the Goths. Well, the Goths are so respected by all Germanic peoples because they were the ones who went down south and took on the Romans, and they spread so far, and everyone knows about them. So, like, I think that other Germanic people were proud to have this kinship connection to the Goths, and now genetic evidence has showed the Goths originate in Sweden, and that's what some people at the time said. Some medieval historians in France, I mean, some actual historians living medieval times referred to Scandinavia as the womb of nations, saying that the Franks originated in Scandinavia, and that's been vindicated because we know now that basically the Germanic people sort of poured out of Scandinavia into the continent and replaced other peoples or mixed with other peoples. But yeah,
that is fascinating. I was listening to Dan Carlin just the other day. He did a lot of podcasts years ago called Thor's Angels, and he talked about the womb of nations. There's one sort of in Central Asia, sort of the Altai Mountains, like where the Mongols came from, and lots and lots of people seem to have just constantly funneled out from there. And same in Scandinavia. Seems to have been a womb of nations, a womb of peoples.
Yeah,
just constantly.
To answer your previous question, like, it isn't because of other tribes pushing them out necessarily. Right, I think Scandinavia specific. The case of Scandinavia may be like a kind of people pump because it has fluctuating over the centuries climates, And for example, 18th century, a lot of people had to leave Sweden because it had previous good weather for a few centuries, and then the population expanded, and then it got very bad. There's not enough food, and people are starving, and they all flee to America and become Minnesotans, whatever. That's why you have lots of... So that kind of thing happens. The population grows a lot, and then suddenly there's very bad weather, and then you get Nordic people just flooding Europe all over the place and causing havoc. I think something like that could have happened rather than sense. More people. But most of the ones who came to England, though, are not coming directly from Scandinavia. In 2022, a study of Anglo-Saxon DNA did speculate that a certain amount, not speculate, sorry, it did theorize based on genetic evidence that a certain amount of them came from southern Sweden. But I think a subsequent study, which looks at DNA in a different way, in a more detailed way of kinship sharing, shows that no, actually the majority of the Anglo-Saxons were coming from exactly the places Bead said they were coming from, which is the Jutland Peninsula, Jutland, some pronounce it, Julund in Danish. I say Jutland because that's what it should be called. But the Jutland Peninsula and the angle of, Schleswig-Holstein, Lower Saxony, exactly what you'd expect them to be coming from.
Yeah. That just makes perfect sense when you look on the map.
That's where he said they came from, and that's where they did come from. Sometimes Bede's right.
What's your feelings on Bede then, in general? Are you, do you enjoy reading Bede, or is it a slog, or do you put much store in what he says? Or
a lot of people, Bede can be read by a non-historian. You could just pick it up and read it. It's not hard going.
You can just get a Penguin paperback for like $7.99.
I think that don't be intimidated by looking through some ancient monks, impenetrable prose. It's just some guy talking about what he thinks happened in his country. To give you a context of what kind of a guy he was, he's a Northumbrian raised in basically an enclave of Mediterranean Roman culture in barbarian Northumbria at a time when there are still pagans running around England, and most of the old civilized way of life of Roman is gone, but these little monasteries are...
He's a monk.
He's still plugged into the Mediterranean way of life, and he's been raised that way. He's not like a convert or anything like that. He's been raised in it. He's fully literate, and everything he's reading and indulging culturally is foreign. It's not England. It's all stuff from the Christian Roman world.
And we're talking late 600s? It's the 600s. Is it late 600s?
It's
in and around that.
He's late end of the 7th century. So there's a few. I think there's definitely a few pagans kicking around. Certainly, if he didn't know any pagans personally, he definitely would have known people who knew pagans. The older people he knew would have known pagans. Definitely would have known lots of pagans. Probably had seen pagan rituals. So when he's talking about paganism in England, let's say we don't know exactly how much he saw firsthand. It's certainly possible he's seen pagan stuff firsthand. But even if it hasn't, it's not very far removed from it. Other monks who he knew personally, or people who traded with the monasteries, would have seen and known pagans in that country. So he's writing about the history of England, but he's calling it the ecclesiastical history of England. He wants to talk about England as a Christian people. And he's inventing England in that way, because England was not yet fully a Christian people. It was almost, and it certainly wasn't really a people in a united political sense yet. But he's planting the seeds that would allow Alfred and Ethelred to make England a nation.
Definitely. He's long before there's a single kingdom, whether you want to say Alfred or Athelstan or whatever. He's quite a long time before that, hundreds of years before that.
So we owe him a debt for inventing, coherently saying the gentis Anglorum exists, meaning the English race are a thing. And he fully admits that they were pagan. He's probably a bit embarrassed about that. But he glosses over, doesn't give us a great insight into the pagan religion, but we know some of the gods from him. And he's talking a bit about the settlement process and how it happened. But that is, how trustworthy is he? I'd say as long as you look at him for what he is, then you can read his biases. He is a man who is a Christian who wants to define the English as a people in opposition to the Celtic Christians. So the problem is that he simultaneously believes in the prestige of Christianity, and he wants to make sure that the English people are recognized as not being like the Celtic people who were Christian for longer. So it's a bit embarrassing for him. because
he's loyal to Rome. You mean is what you're saying then?
I think this is a misguide as well. Some people think that like there was this thing called Celtic Christianity that was this like separate version of Christianity that existed in Britain, but I don't think that ever really existed. I don't think that the Christianity of the Celts was as distinct from any other kind of Christianity in Western Europe at the time as people sometimes say. There was a disagreement on the placement of Easter. Other than that, there's not that much difference. It's pretty much the same. And there's, this Roman, they're both Roman.
Yeah, right. I mean, so let's talk a little bit about Christianity then, get it out of the way. Because you're pagan, right?
I'm a pagan.
And I'm not Christian. But nonetheless, fascinated by it. When you read Bede, I mean, it goes back to St. Augustine of Canterbury, right? So, we've had Christianity here since near the beginning of Christianity being the main religion in the Roman world, in one way or another.
Yeah, it's been here because there were soldiers, but it doesn't mean it was dominant or anything.
So it's not like it's just absolutely not the case that the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes bought Christianity. No.
And he wouldn't make that claim. He doesn't try to make that claim either,
right.
Which would be pure jingoism if he did.
But so then there's this idea that that perhaps the Vikings or just the Norsemen push out Christianity to some degree in the areas that they come to. It's getting a bit later in time now, but nonetheless, that there's this sort of this outpost of Celtic Christianity. Sort of this narrative of it's clinging on by its fingernails in places like Skellig St Michael or something. Some really obscure places like out in Ireland and stuff.
Well, Ireland remained Christian all of the time. Yeah, Ireland was Christian.
And then when Rome reasserts itself, that there's some sort of, this is what you're talking about, that there's some sort of, schism might not be the right word, but two different forms of Christianity sort of battling for supremacy in these islands. And you're just saying that you don't think there's much to that, really? No,
I don't think that's true. I think that what you're seeing was an ethnic conflict.
But that narrative, sorry, before you go on, that narrative, you will see that in quite a lot of books.
Yeah, I know, especially older ones.
I'm not saying you're wrong or they're right.
I mean, first off, I'm not a theologian, so I can't talk too much about like the schism. But it doesn't seem like anyone at the time is talking very much about a schism. It does seem
that's a bit strong for me.
It's just they have a different dating of Easter.
Right.
Other than that, okay, yes, they have the Celtic Christians had a kind of monastic tradition in the same way as St. Anthony. It's based on St. Anthony's. He secludes himself into the desert and just go. Their desert was these little monasteries on the Celtic islands or whatever. There's no theological reason that the church would oppose that. The English were converted by two missions. One of them was from the Gaelic monastery of Columba on Iona, which also sent missions to Pictland to convert the Picts and to the Gaels in Britain, because the Gaels who invaded, some of the Gaels, the Scoti who invaded Britain were still pagan, whereas all the Gaels in Ireland had converted. So the Christian Gaels sent missions to their Gaelic brothers in Britain to make them convert. They sent missions to the Picts to make them convert, some of the last Celtic pagans then gone. And they sent a mission to Northumbria to convert the ancestors of Bede. So Bede's part of England was converted by the Celts. The south of England was not converted by a Celtic missionary. It was converted directly by the Gregorian mission.
St. Augustine.
Yeah.
Right.
So...
of Canterbury.
Of Canterbury, yeah. So the two St. Augustines.
Yeah.
And St. Augustine had a pretty, for the accounts we have, like a pretty receptive audience, because the pagan king said, "Look, we're not going to take your religion. Sounds very nice, but we've got our own religion. Thanks. However, you're free to go and preach among us if you like, and we're not going to stop you. And we'll look after you and make sure no one hurts you." And so they were like, "Green light, let's fucking do this." And then, excuse me.
No.
And then, so they pushed really hard on the mission, because they refused to convert initially, but they didn't ban him from, like the Japanese, they didn't ban missionaries, which would have been if they'd recognized the pagan kings of England did not recognize Christianity as a threat, but they also didn't initially want to convert to it. But that obviously over time, when you've got people disseminating propaganda, it's only unchecked.
It's quite open-minded of them. It's classic sort of polytheism, really. It's like, there isn't just one God and there's one word and it's the only way, and anything else is heresy that must be burnt out. No, it's like, go ahead.
It's also diplomacy, because their Frankish brethren, the brothers on the continent, this is where the wealth is. The Merovingians are richer, and it's important to have good relations with them. I think that a lot of the conversions of Anglo-Saxon kings were based on things like keeping up with the Joneses. Like, this was the new fancy cult that all the rich guys on the continent are involved in.
Right.
And, the last Germanic people to the table are the Scandinavians, and they're the poorest and most, peripheral. So it's not a coincidence.
And wasn't it the king? Is it the story go? The king's wife was already Christian, wasn't she? Whispering in his ear.
Yeah,
saying, at least give him an audience.
Well, they were actually keen for Anglo-Saxon. They wanted Christian women to marry. You'd think like the church would tell Christian women, don't marry pagan men, but they didn't. They said they were very happy when Christian queens would marry a pagan king, because then they've got one in his court, whispering in his ear, saying, "Oh, you know how women can be," and and then also his children, who, the king doesn't have time to, give religious instruction to his own children. So
I think it was the same for Clovis. I think his missus was Christian first.
Yeah, they're very, very, they're very good. Like, Christianity is the first mass, what's the word? Like, mass ideology. Well, it's not, maybe ideology is wrong, because ideology is such a modern concept. It's a religion, not an ideology, but it's first to deal with the mass mind. The way ideology does, ideology thinks of man in terms of the mass mind. Christianity did that first, and it was like, how can we win minds, and what is the process by which we, get access to the children and the women and and the power centers, and then force them to disseminate our preferred rules and laws. So it was very systematic and very effective in its takeover.
Well, Christianity in that period, we might be used to sort of an extremely weak-wristed, wishy-washy Church of England, but that's not what they were doing. So it was more than just a theology. It is also a political ideology, much as like Islam is. It's more than that, even, right? It's a way of, it's a whole system of thought.
Well, a
whole way of structuring.
Yeah, it's
society.
Like an ideology. Yeah, it's a holistic way of being. It's completely encompasses everything. Yeah. I didn't want to use the word ideology, because I think that that has a specific association with post-religious ways of being.
It's like an 18th century word.
But
I think people understand what I'm trying to get at by saying that.
Yeah,
it's more than just a theology.
Yeah. It's a way. Yeah, it's the same as Islam. Like you said, it's an entire way of life. Like, you don't just say, "Okay, I'm a Christian now. I'll see you at church on Sunday." That's the end of it. It's like, no. You've got to enforce this. You've got to completely prevent anyone from worshipping the old religions, and you've got to kill them if they try and do it.
One last thing between before we move on from Christianity entirely, between the Celtic form of Christianity and the Roman sort of Gregory mission form of it. Their artistic aesthetic was different, though, right? That's fair to say, is it not? That in the archaeology, you can say this is highly Celtic Christian. And
that's a great question. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because, well, I can't give a yes or no because it's a bit complicated. But like the late Roman artwork is in the British Isles. It's like, there's not a lot of artifacts there, but like, it's not always explicitly Christian in its context. And like, the definitive art style that most people call Celtic knotwork or Celtic wrongly, and associated with insular Christianity everywhere from Ireland to Cornwall to England, all across the British Isles, comes from Anglo-Saxon pagans. And that style is because the monks who went to, the Aidan mission to Northumbria, these Gaelic Christians adopted the pagan style of art from the Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons of these interlocking serpents and things, knotwork, and they produced their own version of it in manuscript forms, and that style of art in those manuscripts became the defining insular, what we call insular art style. Some people call it Celtic knotwork or whatever, and they call it Celtic because it's seen all over Ireland and Scotland or whatever, but it comes from English pagans, and it becomes also definitive of Christianity in these arts, because the first manuscripts and the first Christian crosses all have this artwork on it, but it didn't exist in Celtic art. It didn't exist in the Roman period. It didn't exist except in Scandinavia among Odin worshippers, because all these intertwined serpents and things it's basically like two parts of pagan theology. Like, one, they believe that all reality, fate, is actually an interwoven web of threads, which is controlled by the Norns. Weird, it's called, fate, or it's where we get the word weird from. And also, they believe that when you die, the underworld is full of snakes and serpents. So seeing all these interwoven threads and snakes and things reminds you of death and of fate and of being the entire totality of existence. And that is adopted very cleverly by the Gaelic monks and becomes something very Christian instead.
And we can say it's certainly not Roman. And when I say Roman, I don't mean ancient Rome. I mean Catholic, where the popes is what I'm talking about.
It's not present. It's not present in before that. It's not present before that contact. And the first example you can see of it is in Scandinavia and northern Germany, where it's called Salinstyle 1. And it's believed that the Germanic pagans at that time, they didn't have it until the migration era. Germanic people invented it in the migration era, and they believe it is called zoomorphic animal style, based on art from the steppe. So it's got some precedents in Scythian art from the first millennium BC, but it doesn't appear in continental Germanic Europe until like 300s, so 4th century or something like that. And there's a few hundred years gap there, and I think that the transmission from Iranic Scythian barbarians to Germanic barbarians was facilitated probably via Hunnic and Turkic peoples, with whom I already said during the migration era, the Germanic people had close contact. So they would have taken this style of art, changed it because it's not the same as steppe art, changed it to integrate all these knots. That's the main thing. The animal style, the zoomorphic animal style of the steppe was then turned into all these strange knotwork and then taken up by Gaelic monks to become what we call like Christian Celtic art.
And you just don't see it in Byzantium, in Greece, the Balkans, Italy, Spain, North Africa.
What you do get there is vine scroll, where you have like you can have like often at the side of margins on manuscript or on like on a sarcophagus or something, vines, like grapevines, like tangled up, but it's very clearly grapevines, and the knots are not like, they're more elegant. Whereas what you see like that Celtic style is like this dense, like impenetrable, like so complicated and almost like that you look at them in a completely different way. That like elegant sort of vine scroll in ancient classical art that transferred into early Christian art is something just like quite harmonious rather. I mean, and it's sort of, just like a pleasant border. Whereas the Celtic or Germanic knotwork is something else. It's very intricate, and it's something you stare at like a magic eye puzzle, and you can look at it for ages. You're like, wow, there's so much it's so complicated. And I think that's how you were intended to look at it. You were supposed to stare at it like a psychedelic sort of experience or something like that.
Yeah, or like those incredible manuscripts of stained glass. It's sort of for the illiterate. You can't read the text, so you're given something visual that you can focus on. Okay, so let's move on from that a little bit. Let's go talk about Radwald and Sutton Hoo.
Yeah,
because that is quite early on, right? We don't know if it's definitely Radwald, but
it's very, very likely to be.
Okay, you think you
for a number of reasons.
If you had to put 50 quid on it, you would.
I'd say it is. I mean, I'd usually really hate when like they find a grave is found somewhere in the world, like ancient Greece, and like this is Alexander of Macedon, or this is like they want to put a name on it so they can say we know for sure when there's so many people it could be. But in this case, we can date it quite well, and we know the region, and that's the region and the place where this king existed. And also we know about his life from Bead's description. I think it's Bead, like says that Radwald was this guy, he was a pagan, and then he started to adopt Christianity, and he put a Jesus idol in the temple of the gods next to Woden and Frey and Thunor and the Anglo-Saxon gods, but he continued to sacrifice to the pagan gods as well. And then later on, he went back to being a pagan. Obviously, he probably figured out that you're not allowed to have... He thought it was like a non-exclusive deal at first. Right. And then he was like, oh, okay, this is a bit more culty than I realized. You can take him back.
But isn't that interesting, where that you can be more than one thing at once? It's possible, or you can go and you can recant or be an apostate or whatever. There's a grey area, a crossover period.
Well, you weren't allowed to. He obviously didn't. It shows that the king, the preachers who brought Christianity to the king, didn't impress upon him the actual nature of Christianity, right. So that he completely misunderstood it. And obviously, none of his advisors or anyone were able to communicate to him what Christianity really was well enough that he would not do this thing. Or eventually someone obviously did explain to him, and then he was like, oh, I don't want it anymore. So he became an apostate.
Like Madonna getting into Kabbalah briefly.
Yeah, figuring out it's a bit more than she's bargained for. Yeah. But why do I think that it's him? Well, the time's right, the place is right, and then the grave is an unambiguously pagan barrow, ship burial, very Scandinavian specifically type, because actually most of West Germanic peoples don't have ship burials. It's almost exclusively North Germanic. It's this style of helmet and this style of ship burial is found a lot in eastern Sweden. So it actually made people at first think that this was somehow a Swedish connection, but it's not from Sweden. It's an angle, and it just shows that the boat grave phenomenon was quite widespread. A ship grave rather, because it's boat grave preceded, but this is a big ship, very prestigious burial. The helmet is fully an Odinic artifact. It represents Woden. One side, the garnets have a gold leaf behind that makes it shine, and the other doesn't. The dragon has one shining eye and one non-shining. The dragon goes over the crest, and then the pressplex are impressed with pictures of horned Odin dancers who have these two ravens crest on and dance with spears. Woden was the spear god and the raven god, and he had these two ravens representing thought and memory. It's very much this is the helmet of a Woden worshipper. And there's loads of other very clearly Woden artifacts depicting two ravens within it. But there's also Byzantine Christian artifacts in it with saints' names engraved and crosses and stuff, imported all the way from probably Constantinople or somewhere like that. Somewhere in Byzantium.
Some of the garnets are from India or the Indus Valley.
Yeah, well, the garnets, that's another matter, because the garnets are probably from Sri Lanka or something like that. But they're not, that doesn't show a cultural connection to Sri Lanka. No. Those are just, the garnets are probably traded. That's just
trade.
The trade, Germanic art always used these red garnets that come from South Asia. There was a trade route. They probably had no idea where these garnets were coming from. Okay. That's not the case with the Byzantine silverware. They knew that this was Christian silverware, and they knew it was coming from there, and he didn't acquire it randomly, like along a trade route. It's possible. One theory is that the people who got these were because they actually were serving as federati in the emperor's army, and they were given these as presents.
The Byzantine emperor.
Yeah, like the Byzantine emperor. And that would mean that would explain why he converted to Christianity, because he spent some time in what's now Turkey, and he was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, sure. Okay, now give me the silver. And then he goes home and he's like, now I'm back to going to Woden. Or it could just be that he had men in his retinue who had served over there, and they get gifted, as the cycle of wealth in Germanic society is such that the king or lord is surrounded by his best men, and they go out, acquire gold, riches, give them all to the king, in Germanic cultures they refer to the king as a ring breaker, which means someone who distributes wealth, because you give him a gold ring, he'd break it up and give it out to everyone, all his best guys. The more you do for him, the more he gives back to you. And also he looks after the people who don't have anything. It's like it's a very managed economy, with a centralized managed economy. Everything goes through him, and but he's expected to be very open-handed and
a river to his people.
Yeah, this is what they call a good König, someone who really helps all the people, but also rewards loyalty. And the whole culture was so centered around military loyalty to their leader. Like they were happy to die for him passionately, whereas the Roman military had previously had, dispassionate, regimented, highly trained warriors. The Germanic war system was based on the extremely passionate desire of the soldier to protect his lord, and who would go into battle with them. So they would, want to win glory that way, and they would never want to return from a battle where he had died. It would be a very great shame to them. So this guy, Radwald, he's got these Christian stuff in his burial. So he obviously has a life of, not a Christian burial at all, but it's got very, very clearly Christian goods, and it fits the bill. It's Radwald, I think.
Okay. One quick thing to say about the famous helmet. Yeah, absolutely, with the Woden connection, with the one eye and all sorts of things. The other thing I thought was fascinating is in the general design with the neck guard and the cheek guards. It's a Roman cavalry helmet.
It certainly is. Yeah.
So we're still in the shadow of the Roman world.
Yeah, it's a good point.
In all sorts of ways. But I've got a couple of shorts where me and Carl went to the British Museum to do a thing about the Assyrian friezes one time. But while we were there, we also just quickly did a few shorts about the other things. Of course, we had a quick look at something. Actually, have you ever been to the actual place?
I used to go there every bloody day. You mean really? The Sutton Hoo? You mean the British Museum?
No, the actual Sutton Hoo.
No, I've never been to that. I've never been there.
I went there once, many moons ago. And there's like a Georgian Victorian house there, and it's all out in the grounds. And there's some other barrows there which are unexcavated, but they've done like geophys or whatever they've done, and decided there's nothing under them. But just one thing I want to say, because it is so famous. Anyone knows anything about the Anglo-Saxons, it's almost to the point of cliche. It's very, very famous. I remember being a very small child being told all about Sutton Hoo and being showed pictures of it. But I do think it is an absolutely remarkable thing. When you see those photos from the 30s or the 1940s, I think they first found it just before World War II started, and they did all the excavations just after the war ended. When you see the photos of this outline of a ship,
pig excavation,
it blows my mind. And when you look at what they actually found, because it's not just that helmet, as you mentioned, loads of things, for a whole room really full of treasures.
Yeah, it's a ship burial tradition.
I mean,
that continued for hundreds of years.
Thing. It was just sitting there in someone's back garden, essentially. I mean, it's more than the back garden. They had land, but it was just sitting on their land, and they just thought that might be that may well be some sort of barrow of some type. But
there were several barrows on her land.
They
did dramatization of the excavation and how it came about on Netflix called The Dig.
Is it any good? Is it worth watching?
Actually, it's quite an entertaining drama, but they make Stuart Piggott a homosexual, which he was not. A repressed homosexual.
Did they make him black?
No, they just made him gay, but he was not gay. And it's like this whole thing about he's married, and like they're trying to make out he's like a closeted homosexual. There's no reason for anyone to think that. They just decided to add that in, as a narrative thing. It doesn't help you understand anything. But what they also took out is interesting. Is that the lady, and by which lady I mean she was an aristocrat of some kind. Yeah. She the reason she wanted to excavate is because she saw an army of ghosts marching around the barrow. And that she was what was the word, clairvoyant, whatever they used to say, and very popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that people believed in spiritism and stuff. My great grandmother around that time, when her husband died, had a medium communicate with him from the dead and things like that.
I think it was the same with her. Her husband died.
People did that quite a lot then, more than people might imagine. Anyway, she said she could see an army of soldiers marching around the barrow. And that's why she told them to excavate that one. And people like to gloss over that. But it was right.
Yeah, well, she wasn't wrong.
And it to me sounds like that could have been part of the funerary ritual, that his retinue would march around the barrow, perhaps after having interred him.
I mean, it does set your imagination on fire. It does me, even to this day, because it's not like we've found loads of these. It's pretty unique. There probably were a lot more been robbed and whatever over the years, but I just find it not just the actual treasure itself, which you can go and see in the British Museum in Bloomsbury, get off at Holborn, or Tottenham Court Road.
You've got to see
the actual. I just find the actual site, and that it was again when you see the old black and white photographs of this, it's a big thing. I think it's quite bloody big.
Big
and So, but that infers so much. He must have been extremely powerful and rich, and there must have the amount of. I mean, it's quite near a river, but nonetheless, the amount of energy, time and energy to have dragged that up there and buried it, or at least half buried it and build a mound over it. And the amount of wealth that they just put in there, essentially lost to them now at this point.
They didn't see it like that, of course. But,
no, true.
But also, and it's not just the things that are on display in the museum. Like there would be huge amounts of animal sacrifices, and this wouldn't have just been like.
What would
it wouldn't have been a funeral like today, where you just stick someone in the ground, say the prayers, and cover them up. This would have probably gone on for days. So this would have had
feasting and
the barrow would have been like partly open with the boat within it, and there would be a whole process of feasting, drinking, animal sacrifices, and horses all going in there. And this is the same essential burial tradition you see. Like the Saxons in England didn't have boat burials anywhere. It's only Angles who did it. So there's Anglian regions. But in continental Europe and in Scandinavia, it was happening a lot. And it carried on right into the Viking Age, so that even though, by the 7th, 8th century in England, there's no more pagan burials in the 8th century. But until the Vikings come back and they bring back the exact same burial right. So you find in Scotland now, they find boat burials in barrows in Scotland.
But they're Viking.
But they're Viking. They're not Anglo-Saxons. So it's completely different culture, right? Except with the exact same funerary tradition. It's obviously the same culture and the same god as well as the center of their thing. It's like Woden, Odin, it's the same thing. It's like pretending, some people say, if you don't understand why Woden and Odin are the same god, the Old Norse word for wolf is Ulf, and the Old English is wolf. You just take the W away. Woden, Odin. They just took the W off. Worm, Orm. It's the same word. It means snake. But they just take the W away, and there's no big difference in the Viking and Anglo-Saxon religion.
And even the entire tradition of a barrow is much more ancient than either of them.
Right, so, and actually the Anglo-Saxons acknowledged that because the initial Indo-European settlers of the British Isles, the Belbeaker folk, had barrows, and they built a lot of them between 4,500 years ago and around 3,000 years ago. They kind of stopped. People in Britain didn't make any barrows after that, and it's mostly associated, strangely, with the coming of Celtic culture, which is strange because in the continent, Celtic cultures did have barrows. But for some reason, when Celtic culture comes to Britain, it results in the stopping of barrows. But anyway, the Anglo-Saxons therefore came to a country where there were ancient barrows that were if they're 4,000 years now, at least 3,000 years old or whatever, something like that.
So fantastically ancient.
And they were
already.
They were like, those are sacred.
Yeah.
And they built fences around, like for example, at Spong Hill outside Brighton, they build a fence around the Bronze Age barrows, and they use it as a burial ground and bury their dead in those old barrows or in new barrows adjacent to those old ones. So they recognized that the Bronze Age Belbeaker burial tradition was the same as theirs.
Right.
And that's really interesting because later on, Christian Anglo-Saxons stopped thinking of barrows that way. They started to think of them as being Welsh and inhabited by Welsh demons. There's a hagiographic account of an Anglo-Saxon saint who, in the style of St. Anthony, goes to live in the desert, which is on top of a barrow. And there he's assailed by Welsh-speaking demons, which represent the spirits of pagan ancestors. But now, instead of being, early pagan Anglo-Saxons were like, these are our kin in the ground somehow because they have the same burial right. Now the Christians are like, no, these are alien Celtic people. We don't want anything to do with them. We're Christians. So it's an interesting transition.
It's fascinating. There's so many things. We've been going for a little bit of time already, unfortunately. There's so many things I wanted to ask you about. I mean, just one of them, just a complete aside, just while you're talking there, just made me think of an account. I think it was from Geoffrey of Monmouth, where he said about Stonehenge, he thought it'd been magically planted there from Ireland.
by the devil.
It was actually an Irish thing, and magic just placed it on Salisbury Plain.
Was it Merlin or?
I can't remember.
There's one tradition that says Merlin. I mean, there's a manuscript showing Merlin as a giant building Stonehenge, like with Lego blocks or something. But there's another tradition that's something, I think, a giant in Ireland threw the stones from Ireland and they landed in England. They had some funny ideas about Stonehenge, obviously.
Because you wonder what the Romans really thought about Stonehenge, what the Angles and the Saxons really thought about Stonehenge. Just one example. But anyway, we could go into... In fact,
we've got an idea of the Saxons had an expression, enta jawerk, in Old English, meaning the work of the giants or jötnar. Like Eötn means it's like a kind of an enemy of the gods, a monster. And they said about like ancient ruins and things like that. Enter your work. It was made by the monsters like that of old in ancient times. So that's probably what they would have thought of Stonehenge as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say something. What you said about the interesting thing about the helmet of Sutton Hoo being based on late Roman cavalry helmets, and I sometimes think that people, because sometimes as well, like when there's a poem, Anglo-Saxon poem, The Ruin, it talks about some Roman ruins as enter Joerk. So it's like, oh, they're so stupid. They didn't even know about what the Romans were. Well, I think that's misunderstanding, because that part of northwestern Germany has Roman ruins and stone circles, Neolithic stone circles. So none of these things that are in England would have been alien to them, because they had them in their homeland too. It's just poetic. And the interesting thing about like the Britons, the Romano Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, is that they each were Romanized in a completely different way, whereas the Britons had been subjugated and civilized, semi-civilized, not as well civilized as the Gauls had been, who were fully civilized. The Britons had been partially civilized, which means they were familiar with villas and baths and stuff like that, and wine. Like the way of life of the Mediterranean was not unknown in Britain. But to the northern Germanic peoples, not like the southern ones who were neighboring the Romans, but the people like the Angles and Saxons, these things weren't known. But many, many people in the ancient Germanic world, even as far north as Norway, traveled south to, and talk about in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, traveled south to serve in the Roman military. And like even in Norway, in Ovalsnes, near Ovalsnes, there's a burial from like 2nd or 3rd century, which contains a high-status warrior with Roman equipment that he'd acquired from serving in the Roman military, and then gone all the way back to Norway. So they went long distances, and the idea that they didn't pick up any Roman culture at all is absurd. They did, but their Roman culture they picked up was exclusively the military culture. So the Roman depictions on, like, for example, Trajan's column of naked Germanic barbarians with clubs from 2,000 years ago, that's not what we're seeing 1,800 years ago. By that time, they have a military system that is based exactly on the Roman military system, with a similar hierarchy, similar kinds of uniform. The Germanic armor is based on, as you say, late Roman cavalry armor, but it's different as well, because they've integrated with all images of their gods, with Woden and like symbols of power like the boar and the dragon that give them power in battle. But yeah, it's like a kind of military cargo cult, if you will. Like the only thing they took from the Romans is how to kill more efficiently.
I think that's very, very interesting. Because famously, for most of Imperial Rome's time, the frontier was set at the Rhine.
Yeah,
but that doesn't, obviously their culture and their language and all sorts of things didn't go further north. Of course they did. And yeah, I mean, by the time of, again, I'm thinking it wasn't that long ago, I reread in Gibbon the bit of about Honorius and Stilicho and Alaric, and loads of the legions are Germans at that point. Loads, like Swabians and stuff.
Yeah,
loads of it. I mean, the generals were Germans. I mean, you've even got a German bodyguard in the age of Caligula and Claudius and stuff. So, yeah.
And I think this is a lot older than people realize, and the sources indicate, because they just found recently some DNA studies they found 2 Swedish Bronze Age guys in Cyprus. So like people, they might not even have been mercenaries, they might have been merchants, but the Bronze Age trade with Scandinavia and the Mediterranean was big. There was a lot of trade going back and forth. So these the idea like popularized like Viking series that like the northern Germanic peoples were like isolated until the Viking Age is just nonsense. They were
Look
constantly...
at the Varangian Guard, for example.
Yeah, well, that's the Viking Age, but
a bit later. Sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, like
that
the Goths had served previously.
It wouldn't have happened out of nowhere, though, would
it?
That something like the Varangian Guard. It wouldn't just have one day. Oh, now we've got the Varangian Guard. It's like no. Surely there would have been a process that took.
Well, they referred to the Varangians as Goths when they were Vikings. So the fact that the Greeks called the Vikings Goths indicates that they remembered from centuries earlier this relationship with these Germanic people and considered them the same. And that's because they were the same, really the same. And like even people misunderstand what's meant by Germania when Tacitus says is not talking about Germany. Because even like he describes the Teutons, for example, as one of them. That's the Teutons living mostly in what's Denmark, like now Denmark. And the word Teuton is the cognate with Deutsch, the word that Germans called each other. The idea of Germany didn't exist as what we now think of as Germany. And these far-flung regions of Germania, like Norway, those people were even being contacted by the Roman world. It wasn't just the Swabians who lived at the edge of of Roman territory. It was deep into Germanic territories and influence from Rome because it was a very powerful and rich area. And obviously, people go where the money is.
Oh, yeah. Oh no, there's accounts of German people, Germanic peoples, visiting Rome. Again, in like the sort of first century, and people in sort of suburban Rome complaining about them.
Yeah,
that they're these giant, smelly guys with long hair or whatever, and they're a bit scary, but they're not too bad. And anyway, so. Yeah, I mean, well, the interaction between Rome and Germany is fascinating. But we're supposed to be doing the Anglo-Saxons. There's so many things. Well, let's talk about King Arthur briefly then, for a bit. So it's sticky, right? I think that's one of the first things to say. It's a bit sticky because some people like to think of it as a solid history, but most of the accounts are not all that reliable. Like Mallory and Monmouth and. There's various Arthurian.
I think it's good to maybe keep two separate things. First, you have like the early potential accounts of him, which is sparse, extremely sparse, which some people like to try to connect to actual Brythonic leaders, and they may or may not be right. But
what's your feeling?
My interest, I don't care. That's okay. But I think the main thing is Arthur. As we understand, the only reason we're even talking about Arthur is not because he was some great rebel against the Saxon invasion. Like Celtic heroes that actually existed are remembered. Boudica, Caractacus, people like this, they actually exist. But Arthur is just not celebrated like that. There's no stones talking about him like Caractacus is. But Arthur is remembered and is important in our history because of Arthurian romance, which is a product of the High Middle Ages, very much, and the tradition of Romantic literature,
more like 11th, 12th century.
Yeah, and later even. I mean, even like in the 15th century, like the Tudors. Well, Henry Tudor had a big round, in the palace, the large, round table.
Windsor.
Or
was it Edward III was a massive Arthur fan, was it?
It was the Star Wars or like Marvel of the time. Right. Everyone in not just it's France is where it kicks off, like Chrétien de Troyes, and like it's a huge thing.
He's the main one, of course.
And Mallory is copying what he calls the French book, book. And you got Wolfram von what's his name doing Parzival in Germany. So like everyone in the whole of Europe is like obsessed with this canon of these legendary tales set in a mythical age 1,000 years earlier, pretty much. It's not historical. It can't be. Also, he's not just the king of Britain. He's like the king of Scandinavia in some versions. Like he's just like Superman or Batman or something. It's
or a
like,
Robin Hood figure. At best, an amalgam of someone who may or may not have existed.
Yeah. I mean, the Sword in the Stone...
Looking at that, really.
I think the Sword in the Stone comes out of Germanic myth. Like that, you got the Barnstock in Revolutionary Saga where the Odinic hero has to pull the sword out of the tree to I think that's... there's lots of little bits taken from.
What is that? Sorry, that's a Germanic.
Well, the Volsunga saga is an Icelandic saga.
Icelandic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
it would have precedence in ancient Germanic law, but in Odin, it's very Odinic. Like the Odinic hero has to pull the sword out of this tree, which is connected to Odin. So yeah, I think this is a wonderful literary tradition. It's very interesting, and to study it, I only studied it as a literary tradition of the High Middle Ages, and I think trying to connect that back to an actual figure who might have existed kind of removes the value of that literature, which is something completely different. I'm not saying there's no value in actually trying to figure out whether an Arthur exists as Arturius or whatever. There were probably a few Roman generals kicking about who wanted to fight the Saxons, but obviously none of them were that significant because they weren't written about at all. But
although we are right in that, if he were a real figure, we are right in that period when it's at its darkest. Though.
Yeah. I can't remember. I think it's Gildas mentioned someone like that. Or
have you read Chrétien de Troyes? Because I haven't.
No, I can't read. I can't read French. I've read Mallory's Mort d'Arthur.
Yeah, I've read
but I can read Middle English. I can say that.
Can you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I can't.
It helps if you think of it in a West Country accent. I find if you try and read it in a West Country accent, then it all falls into place.
We could get Chrétien de Troyes in translation, could we not? I've never read it.
I've never read it.
But okay, all right.
I've read what other Arthur? I've read The Green Knight. The Tale of the Green Knight is very good. That's the only other Arthurian original text I've read in Middle English. Yeah.
Is that like more like is it Lancelot or Galahad that's basically about?
Neither. It's about is it Percival? I can't remember now. It's the one who was portrayed by a Indian actor in the recent adaptation. But I can't.
Again, sure. Why not?
Dark Britons.
Why not make it a woman, a lesbian woman?
Yeah.
Who's disabled? No.
But this is Christian. This is Christian literature that's intended to impart the Christian morality, not of the Dark Ages, but the Christian morality of the High Middle Ages, and the ideals of the perfect king according to people in the 13th and 14th century. Right. So it doesn't help you understand the culture of the Dark Age, the 5th century. I don't think it's useful. Okay. Arthur, I don't know. Like maybe he existed, maybe he didn't.
Fair enough.
I don't know.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. I remember just one tiny anecdote. I remember once years ago when I used to work in banks, someone said something or other to me, and they'd mixed up Alfred the Great and Arthur.
Yeah.
And I just said, I think you've mixed up Alfred the Great and Arthur, and they're like, oh, really? And I said, yeah. And they were just confused. They didn't know what they were talking about. Sort of thing. No judgment.
I actually think that might be a deliberate consequence of the Norman conquest, because they tried to downplay anything Anglo-Saxon after 1066, and was one of the reasons why they were happy to celebrate the Celtic heritage of Britain, because to them it was less threatening than the English heritage. So you'd see a period where Alfred isn't celebrated anymore.
Well, I remember saying to the same guy, who was a middle-aged guy or older, near retirement, I said, well, Alfred the Great is almost certainly, is a historical figure, and Arthur's almost certainly fictional. And he was like, what? Arthur isn't real? I was like, yeah, no, almost certainly not. And he was like, what, really? And he was like, genuinely...
Start crying.
He was genuinely gutted, he seemed. And just wasn't aware that was a possibility. He'd grown up with the stories, I guess, since he was a small boy. And to have the sort of rug pulled out from under him, he didn't... Anyway.
Yeah. It's like Robin Hood as well. Like, is Robin Hood a real guy? I think not as important as Robin Hood. What's real is the stories of Robin Hood. Those are real, and they've been important for our people for a long time. So in that sense, Arthur is real, because that literature for the least 800 years has been really important for British people. And that's undeniably a real part of our history. Right. So, and I think getting too hung up on whether that was based on a real person denies the 800 years or so of very important history that is real, of us enjoying Arthurian stories.
I've been reading, interesting you should bring up, I've been reading on and off about Robin Hood for a couple of years now. And it's an amalgam. The idea of there was an outlaw in the forest called Robber Hood. It's just like, yeah.
Well, I noticed once I was
sidetracked,
reading an ancient Indian text a few years back, and then I was like, this story is in Robin Hood. And then I checked it out. I was like, oh yeah, the archery contest. That is an ancient Indo-European story. It definitely was not real. Like, you know, a disguised archer, a guy comes in disguise to an archery contest and wins. That didn't happen. I mean, if it happened thousands of years ago, because it's like found in India as far away as like, I don't know what the origin is, but definitely, you know, as you say, it's an amalgam of stories that just are cool stories. Like the guy who wins the contest while disguised and wins the maiden is great.
And they, I mean, even now it's supposed to be set in the age of John, but that wasn't even established particularly for like in the 14th century. They're already telling each other stories about Robin Hood. It's interesting that Friar Tuck seems to have been quite firmly a real figure. Whether
is he real?
Oh yeah. Seems to have been.
He seems so much like an archetype now, like this fat, jolly drunk monk.
I think there were quite a lot of outlawed, drunken monks, but there's one particular who actually went by the name Friar Tuck, and he was a nutter. He was a murderer. He was like a killer. Anyway, we're not talking about Robin Hood another time. So again, we'll have to pass over these things relatively quickly, but there's the period, or talk a few words about the Heptarchy, or the period of sort of 7 kingdoms, the period before Alfred, Athelstan, that sort of. How does that sort of exist in your mind?
This is where I get my knowledge is not as great, but basically you start off with a system of the Heidel system, and a Heid is basically like what amount of land that one family can live on for a year, and then they start. The Heptarchy comes out with like the establishment of these different kingdoms that of varying numbers of Heidel burgage, is it called, or the burgage is when Alfred's got the that's later with Alfred, I think. I can't actually tell you when the Heptarchy was established.
Just it's like, well, it's a process. The period that if we in the age of sort of Radwald, we didn't really have it.
That's not there yet.
By the age of Alfred or Athelstan, let's say, you're looking at like one continuous kingdom, or the supremacy of Wessex. Like it was Mercia was sort of preeminent for a while, but in the end, so it's a relatively small period of time, and it's still a century or more, where there's these 7 kingdoms,
and they eventually become England. So it's like a stepping stone process from like more petty kingdoms consolidating into 7, and then from that 7 to 1. I can't give you a timeline off by the top of my head of when that was established, but
we're talking like it's the 8th century basically.
So definitely the Viking invasions are a catalyst for unification and cooperation between kingdoms. I definitely think that having a common enemy of the Vikings is what basically ensured that England existed as a nation,
right?
Because we were all needed to have a unified system where we were able to have like these burgs or whatever, like these fortified areas that are a set distance from each other. And Alfred established that, and that led the way later for his grandson to make a single.
Well, so I was going to say then, so Alfred is an extremely pivotal figure, again, to the point, almost a cliche, to the point where any small British child should probably be taught about him.
Yes, definitely.
And so that's among one of the many things he's famous for, I would say, is this idea of having some sort of permanent, what we might call, I suppose, maybe a fast reaction force to invasion from the east, or from the sea.
So it's it's going back to what hadn't existed in England since the Roman times,
right?
Which is actually a military, a competent form of military defense from outside invasion.
And we're talking like 3 centuries ago.
Yeah,
right. It's a long. That's quite a long period to just be completely at the mercy of marauders.
Yeah, or at least a partial. I think there weren't so many. There hadn't been any marauders except the English, because the Anglo-Saxons were the marauders initially, and then once they're there, they didn't think the need to like defend the coasts from other marauders until they were so distinct from the Germanic peoples of the regions not far from where they came from initially, that they were suddenly those people represented an enemy. But they would have still been able to talk to Norsemen without a translator. Anglo-Saxon and Norse are similar enough that they would be able to get the gist of each other. And we know for sure, like in Egil saga, one of the Icelandic sagas, Egil is a poet, an Odinic poet, pagan, and he just goes on a jolly to England and serves in the court of King Athelstan for a while, initially as a soldier fighting in the Battle of Brunanburh against the Norse Gaelic alliance, but also he composes poems in the court, presumably because the English court could understand the Icelandic poet at that time, enough at least to enjoy a poem. So they were alien, the Norse, but they were also not. There are times when the Norse allied with, the Cornish allied with the Vikings once to try and fight the English, didn't work out. But the English used Viking mercenaries to fight against other kinds of Vikings and stuff like that. So it wasn't like this clear-cut English versus Viking all the time. But yeah, the main problem was that they were pagan and England wasn't. So that made them foreign. And then we needed to have defenses, but we also needed to construct. And it's another other. We already had the Celtic Christian other. We are not Celtic Christians. We are the English, who are also Christian. But then we have another other, which is Germanic people coming in. Like, we're not like those Germanic people either, because they're heathen. So we have like a very clearly defined Englishness. There's neither Welsh nor Danish. It's something in between.
Right. Yeah. Not sort of the ancient Britons, not Welsh.
The
not
Welsh,
Irish.
Yeah. They would have called them Britons.
So
Britain,
they're Christian. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
And their Christianity is Roman. I don't mean, again, not ancient Rome, but just the Pope sitting in Rome.
Yeah, I think the best way to think of it is
you've got Archbishop of Canterbury, right?
I don't think they define themselves against the Celts according to religious schism. I think they define themselves against the Vikings according to religious differences, because the Vikings were a different religion. But they define themselves against the Celts according to ethnic differences. But I think they believed that they had the same religion as the Celts.
Oh yeah, but I mean, so let me ask you this then, straight up: did all the Celtic Christians recognise the Pope?
Yes, as far as I know, they all did. There was no Protestantism or anything.
No.
I think you get a lot. I mean, we don't have.
They were Orthodox in that sense.
Yeah, they were. It's not like the Albigensian Crusade. When the Cathars, you've got genuine earlier you have the Arian heresy, or which the Goths adopted. There's a genuine heretical difference, like that causes the Catholic Church to oppose them. There's never anything like that for the Catholic. Rome never says it needs to purge. They literally genocided the people in Languedoc, in the Middle Ages. They completely destroyed an entire race of people from history because they had a schismatic version of Christianity. Nothing like that was ever done against Celts. I don't think there was anything in Ireland that threatened the Pope. I don't think they were worried about Irish Christianity or at all, because I don't see any. I've never seen any evidence for it.
Fair enough. I don't know why we keep returning to it. I'm not particularly interested. It's just
a really popular thing that people want to think.
Yeah.
Another one is that I think it's for the same reason people call the knotwork Celtic knotwork. They want to say there was a Celtic Christianity and there's Celtic knotwork, and they want to call everything Celtic. Tolkien said Celtic is a magic hat and you can put anything in it and take anything out of it. It's completely made up what Celtic means even. If people have a Roman religion and speak a Germanic language, why do you call them Celtic? It's just, it doesn't have very much.
Was there not, and this will be the last thing on it, was there not, whether they would be bishops?
I don't know about that.
Who didn't accept the authority of Canterbury and therefore Rome. They just didn't accept them as a legit.
That might be true. I can't tell you. Okay, I can't tell you.
Forget it. All right. So Alfred and Athelstan then. So the Viking invasions are in full swing now. So it was what the earliest stuff is at. Where is it? Lindisfarne?
793, I think, is the first hit on Lindisfarne.
Right. Okay. So
So
it's still quite early, really, isn't it? I suppose it depends how you measure it, but
well, if you think like the very last pagan kingdoms are done like converting in the beginning of the 8th century, and at the end of the 8th century, you've got pagan invaders. There's not very long period of like the security of English Christianity. Like it's only just within living memory almost got rid of the last native English pagans when then foreign pagans turn up again.
Right.
So,
and so the incursions by the men of the north, are eventually, well, getting ahead of ourselves, but okay. So begin with, let's say in like the 8th and 9th century, they do seem to get progressively worse. Yeah, it's pretty bad, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the height of it, I mean, we end up with Canute and stuff, but before that, it's pretty bad and brutal. So I think there was this idea that the Vikings are terrible rapers and pillagers and and then at some point in like probably the bloody 20th century, they were like, oh no, it wasn't all that bad.
Yeah,
they weren't all that bad.
It's like, they have women and children and they looked after their animals. Yeah.
I think it still was pretty bad though.
They definitely did come and just like kill a bunch of people.
From the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, it seems, it was.
They had a tradition of raiding. And also, even if you ignored all the French and Scottish and Irish and English sources on the Vikings and just looked at their own sources, well, they describe each other, killing each other, going to each other, raiding the coastal towns. Like not even just like Swedes raiding Danes. I mean, even in like small Iceland, like there's just this one saga where there's this guy who just decides to, instead of farming like everyone else, he just decides to like get a bunch of big guys in a boat and just sail around to other people's farms, kill them and steal everything and then go back. And like until a bunch of different farmers form like a posse and then march up to him and just say, you got to stop doing this or we're going to kill you. And then they strike a deal and he says he'll go away and not come back instead. But yeah, it's like that was something they did, even at home. So it wasn't like I don't buy this idea like some people want to like try and say it was a retaliation for Christian encroachment on Scandinavia. Well, that doesn't make sense because they always did this. Like it's an ancient part of their culture. It probably goes back to the first time they had boats. Like they used, and in fact, it's an ancient Indo-European thing to raid and your enemies. And also, Gaelic Christians were doing it anyway. Like. Everything the Vikings did that's bad, raiding people, slaving, killing, that's all stuff that everyone else was doing in Europe as well. Like the Celtic people did that too, all those things. So it's like the only thing that was unique about them is that they had boats that went further and they could go long crossing across the sea, and no one had done like a North Sea crossing from Norway to, North England before. So previously people had traveled that route by going south to Denmark, then along Holland and then make the short crossing. But being able to just go straight across the sea like that and hit Scotland or the north of England was completely unexpected. And that's I think that's why no one thought that Lindisfarne was going to get hit from the east. Like it was just not known that was something that could happen.
It's mad when you look at the size of the vessels they were using and how rough those seas are. The North Sea, it's like again, I find it sort of quite a remarkable feat of seafaring.
Incredible.
I'd be scared to cross that bit of sea in bad weather in a modern ship.
Yeah,
it'd be a bit hairy.
Yeah, they probably had the best ships in the world at that time. They're probably the best seafarers in the world at that time.
But they're not that deep. Is it the draft? They're not.
No,
like,
they had several different kinds of ship. I think one's called knoll or something like that, which is a wide one for transporting cargo. And even that doesn't sit that low in the water because it's got this really wide sort of belly. I don't know what all the nautical terms are, but and they had a small one called a farrowing or something like that, which is for like it's a small boat for like small crossings. But the long ship, the big one, which is like puts a whole warband on it, like it's big. And some of them are really impressive. You can see in Oslo's ship museum. The ones in Denmark has a ship museum as well, which is all the ships there are just from ships that they deliberately sunk to make a barrier for the bay to like. So they're not like impressive warships, but the ones from like an Oslo museum are ones like the Sutton Hoo, that are taken from barrows. So these were prestige ships, and they're just beautifully made and like, exquisitely crafted vessels. So yeah, the ones that came to England probably could have been a little bit not as nice as that, but they're probably pretty impressive as well.
I mean, not that I think the Viking attacks were particularly any more brutal than stuff that's been going on since time immemorial, since the sea peoples or whatever. But nonetheless, still brutal if he's on the receiving end of it. I think this idea, this revisionism, that it wasn't all that bad and it's exaggerated and it was all Anglo-Saxon propaganda, I just don't particularly buy that.
Well, it does. It is propaganda, yeah. Or at least it's politicized. It's not necessarily propaganda, but it's a politicized view of history that doesn't help you understand things that well.
As you say, from their own accounts, though.
Yeah, they did this stuff. They did this all the time to each other.
Own accounts, so they're bragging about that they bounced over, butchered everyone, raped a load of women, got everything they could get their hands on, and came back.
Yeah,
they're bragging about.
They went. If you went like they did before the Viking Age even starts. There's in Estonia a failed Viking raid, but like the thing is that there's actually no such thing as the Viking Age from the perspective of Scandinavian history. It's useless to even have that term because it's only relevant from us because that's when we start having the problem of Vikings. So that is a useful term.
They weren't doing anything different.
For them, it was the same business as normal. And previously, they were more, the Swedes particularly were hitting Estonia. Okay. And they basically, a bunch of Swedes had this really a big war band of Swedes hit Estonia, but hit the wrong part and got their asses handed to them, basically, and had to do a very quick impromptu funeral for a lot of Swedish guys near the beach in Estonia before running. And that's what's been discovered in 2008. This huge burial.
I don't know anything about this.
That was discovered 2008 or 9. The excavations, and it's before we officially have a Viking Age. But they probably didn't hit that place again because it didn't go to plan. But Lindisfarne went very well, so everyone was like, "This is a good place to do this." So they keep doing it again, especially if you've got in the winter, is not much to do except huddle around the fire and plan the next summer because they only raided in summer. So the summer is like your raiding time, and they get ready every spring, start kitting out the vessels, how many people, who's the best guys, who's going to come on this raid, and then if you come back, you can be a big shot in town because you came back with a bunch of gold. And you give it to the king, and the king gives back to you, and your social position is in their culture is based on your performance in these kind of things, like fighting abroad is brave. That is all pretty much exactly what the monks in England describe it as. It's like you're getting hit by a sort of semi-professional military force. Like they're not like proper soldiers because they're probably farmers half the year, but they're certainly better trained than monks at fighting, and they will burn and destroy everything. So it's terrible if you get hit, but it's probably not that different to what Anglo-Saxons were doing not long before.
Right, yeah. And men have always sort of done, more or less.
The only difference is, I guess, when Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were warring with each other, or they would not hit monasteries because they would have some kind of respect for the same religious taboos. Just like when heathen Germanic groups were warring against each other, they didn't touch the temple. They don't want to incur the wrath of the gods. But when you have two different religions, then suddenly there's no more. There's a lot less respect for each other. Oh, yeah. So to the Vikings, the gold in a church or a monastery is just up for grabs. It has no religious sacred value. It's just there to take.
So I suppose if we, unfortunately, God, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. Unfortunately, we've got to start drawing it to close. But so there's a few things I want to. Okay, so if we start talking about the end, basically, if we're dating Hastings as the end,
that's traditionally the date that Stamford Hill is the last defeat of the Vikings, and Stamford Bridge. Before the Saxons get beaten by William the Conqueror. But there are other Scandinavian raids on British soil after that time.
Yeah, I think Henry II had a scare. So that's another couple of hundred years.
Yeah, I think
150 odd years.
I think it's in the High Middle Ages there was, but is that Viking? What is a Viking?
Isn't Viking a verb? To go a Viking?
That is true in the Norse language. So there's a kind of Reddit truism where people are like, Viking isn't a type of person, it's something you do, it's not who you are. Well, yeah, but the English people, when they said Viking or Viking, Wicing, that means pirate, they're specifically talking about Danes, and they're using it as a synonym for Danes.
Right.
So when we see like Somalians now, we don't call them Vikings because they're pirates. Like we say pirate.
Yeah.
So it's a bit annoying when people do that. Like it is possible for a word to change meaning.
Sure, right, yeah.
Yeah.
If the people used it a certain way, they used it as a noun or proper noun for centuries or millennia, then it's okay. You can still do that.
You can do it now. It's like when people say to me, how can you say you're pagan when that means redneck? I was like, well, it meant that 2,000 years ago, but words don't have the same meaning. Like that's not how words mean. Like skirt and shirt are actually the same word originally. Like skirt comes from the Norse into English and shirt comes from Anglo-Saxon into English, and both from the same Proto-Germanic thing, but you can't think a shirt and a skirt mean the same thing.
Right.
It's just not how language works.
I've got this one take. I wonder if you agree with it or not. And it's this, that lots of people say, again, in something like History of the English-Speaking People by Churchill, something like that, or a modern book, they will say that the Anglo-Saxon world died on that day in Hastings. And although it won't be 100%, but still nonetheless, broadly speaking, that's a thing. The cream of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was killed that day, or certainly over the next small handful number of years were replaced. By the time you've got the sons and grandsons of William the Bastard, it's a Norman world. I mean, we can disagree over the degree of that being true or not. But my take would be this, is that that whole thing of Edward the Confessor, Godwine, and Harold Godwinson, that was like a swan song. The original ones were killed by Falkbeard and Canute, like another 50, 60 years before that. You've got like the St. Brice's Day massacre right at the beginning of the 11th century, and Falkbeard comes over and wins, but then dies quite quickly, and Canute takes over. And like Canute's a man of the North, right? He is a Viking.
Yes, a Christian. But...
A Christian Viking, but nonetheless, he is a Viking. And they wiped out at that point in the early 11th century. They wipe out the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy mainly.
Do they?
Is that not the case?
Well, certainly not.
And Canute puts in all his own men for because his reign was quite long, really long. And he puts in loads of Vikings, it's like the most senior men. They pass away or fall out of favour for whatever reason, and replaces lots of them with a new tranche of Anglo-Saxons. So like people like Godwine, if they would never have been there otherwise.
Interesting theory. Yeah, I suppose I'm not sure to what extent that they were completely replaced across the country, and also the way that aristocracy works in a Germanic culture is not like there's lots of nobles. Like I said, there's a king and he's surrounded by nobles, but Tacitus said of their kings that their authority is not absolute and they can always be replaced by another nobleman. So it's like this, if you're from that caste, if you will, you can always be an aristocrat. You can always be picked up by a king. You can even be a king. It's not like there's only one royal bloodline. And the way that the royal genealogies worked for the Anglo-Saxons to show that they're royal blood of kings is not the same as now, because all of them have this tradition of being 9 removes from Woden. So I'm 9 generations away from Woden, because 9's a sacred number of Woden. And this is even when they're Christians, right? So it's and even when it gets further and further away, they just take people out. So they have these genealogies, it's more you're a noble, and you know that because of your social position. That's all required. Secondly, you're popular with everyone. And then you've got this mythic genealogy. That is what it takes to be a king, really. And it's not so much that there's a limited number of a limited number of families, but I think there's a lot more noble Anglo-Saxon nobles than perhaps you're implying here, because there's big families and things, and people from those and these people that were later installed were not like, they're not like thralls or something, are they? They're going to be from the same noble class.
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, well, to be honest, I don't think the chronicle is clear enough one way or another to actually prove or disprove what I was saying there.
Yeah.
But it just seems like there was this whole, whether, I don't know, it just seems like to me that during the age of Canute, there was a changing of the guard in some ways on the Anglo-Saxon side of the scales. Just seems like there's a changing of the guard.
With Anglo-Danes, maybe. But even they would have Anglo-Saxon blood, and because the Anglo-Danes had mixed with them. They weren't like pure.
Right.
And I mean, like, even like, there's a guy preaching Christianity in Scandinavia called Eskil, and Eskil is not an Anglo-Saxon name; it's a Norse name. But he's referred to everywhere as an Englishman and as English by the Norse people. So I presume Eskil was, or he came from York. I presume he was of Norse origin. But as far as they're concerned, in Scandinavia, he's English.
Right.
They don't call him a Norseman. Whereas the Norse Gaels, as they're called now, like the Norsemen in Ireland, who've mixed with Irish people and were of like half Irish blood, they're not called Norse Gaels by the Norsemen. They're just called Norse people. They're just Norse people from Ireland. So whereas something happened with these Anglo-Danes where they're not Danes anymore. They're just English as far as the thing.
It's very interesting. Again, I suppose the things that spring to mind while you're talking there is Emma of Normandy, where she's what? She's the wife of Ethelred the Unready, and then the wife of Canute. And she's
Passing
the mother
around.
of right.
And then she's
the mother of the Confessor and other. What is it? Edmund Ironside? Is it? I can't remember. But anyway, this mixture of the Norse people and the Anglo-Saxons, where it is becoming, on some level, a bit blurred.
I think that's normal. That's what just happens.
Yeah,
like, leaders like have and also that the Norse genetics are not different from the Anglo-Saxons anyway. It's pretty much the same. But what happens after the Norman conquest is quite similar too, because it's not like they just murdered all the aristocrats. Some of the Norman men deliberately married Anglo-Saxon noblewomen. So they immediately, within one generation, have half Anglo-Saxon blood. And noble blood as well, so that helps to legitimize their claims over the natives. And also, not all the noble families were eliminated on the paternal line either, because you can see in the Doomsday Book there are Anglo-Saxon family names, like land-owning, like powerful families in England of Anglo-Saxon origin at Doomsday Book. So it's not like they just eliminated all of every single part of England that existed before. It certainly was a catastrophe for the English people, and they weren't as powerful as they were, and they had to share or like had to be subordinate to a French aristocracy. And afterwards, I think that for the entire Middle Ages, after the Norman conquest, France is the main foreign country to which we look, and probably has been ever since in many respects. But prior to that, it was not that case. I think we had in the Anglo-Saxon period a stronger tie to Germanic Europe than to France. And even our ties to France were mainly to the Franks, as in the Germanic Merovingian dynasty. So that's what changed. And as a result, our leaders spoke French for a long time after the Normans, like the Plantagenets. And also, I was saying this before we started filming, like a lot of French DNA is in England. Your DNA test shows you're part French. And I was saying that's probably from the High Middle Ages, because it's not that the Normans changed the DNA. The Norman conquest might not have actually changed the genetics of the nation very much, because the Normans weren't that many, and they're an elite, and they can't have that big an impact on the wider population. But the process of being Frenchified over the following centuries allowed a lot more travel back and forth from England and France. So English DNA going there and French DNA coming here. And that is the consequence specifically in northern France and southeastern England. There's just a lot of gene flow going back and forth there.
It's not just like the Norman invasion of 1066, but then there's all sorts of wars still going on in Picardy, Normandy, the Low Countries, all throughout the Angevin Empire times. Henry V re-invades Normandy and Rouen, and on and on and on and on and on.
It's like we got our eyes on France after that time in a way we didn't before. It's like there's this connection ever since then between England and France, love-hate relationship. But it's still going on now.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like a brother you don't get on with.
Yeah.
But he's still your brother. You wouldn't dream of really hurting him.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't dream of killing him, but you might have a punch up.
Yeah.
Often. But he's your brother still. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. It's hard for it's the one country English people love to hate, but also they don't really hate it that much. They just like pretend to sometimes for fun.
Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately, we do have to bring it to a close there because the producer dudes need a bit of time before they go home to do a few bits and bobs. So unfortunately, we've got to end it there. But I love that because there was so many little avenues I would have liked to have gone down.
Sorry if I ramble too much. I'm going all different ways. Yeah.
No, I love picking the brain of someone who knows more than me about something. I just love it. I don't get people who've got a chip on their shoulder or resent someone who's knowledgeable. You know, you must have come across
I try and get the knowledge off them. I try to get it off them if I can.
You must have come across that in your life, though, where people just take a dislike to you because you're knowledgeable about something. I mean...
it's hard to tell because there's too many reasons why someone might take a dislike to me, so I can't tell which one.
No, I love it. So I'd love to have you back in again whenever you can, or we could do something remotely or whatever. There's a million and one things I'd love to pick your brain about.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Bo.
Oh, no, thank you.
And maybe get your insights as well. Very interesting.
Maybe one time we could talk about in detail the religious side of things, because I know that's one of your big.
I'm really interested in religion as how it changes the way people think, how mass changes in thinking occur, because that's the story of history that matters most. I think, like how masses of people change the way they think. Deep
into Norse mythology. I take it you know Norse mythology. Well, I know you do.
Yeah, I know. I'm intimately familiar with it.
Detail. Yeah, that'd be good too, because I've got a working knowledge. But I'm by far expert. So that might be a cool one as well.
That'd be fun, yeah.
But okay, once again, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And out there, I hope you guys like that. Until next time, take care.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.